My name is Margaret Voss. I am 47 years old. On a Thursday evening in September, 3 years ago, I stood at a podium in the atrium of the Whitmore Cardiac Center at St. Catherine's Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, in front of approximately 260 people who had gathered for the dedication ceremony of the cardiac care wing, whose interior design I had spent 14 months completing. And I looked out at the audience and I found my father's face in the fourth row. And I understood, with the specific completeness that certain moments produce, that everything I had been told across 22 years about the value of the work I had chosen to do was in the room simultaneously, the telling and the answer to the telling, and that the answer was the building behind me, real and specific, and named for the family whose gift had funded it and designed every square foot of it by me. My father's name is Whitmore Voss. He is 73 years old. He spent 38 years as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing company in Providence, and he is, in the specific way of engineers of his generation and his background, a person for whom the value of anything is most legibly expressed in whether it works, whether it produces a measurable outcome in the physical world, whether it solves a problem that needed solving in a way that can be quantified and verified and pointed to. He is not a cruel man. I want to say this clearly because what I am about to describe could be read as the story of a cruel man, and it is not. He is a man whose entire framework for understanding what mattered in the world was organized around a specific definition of productive work, the definition of someone who had spent 38 years designing components for manufacturing equipment, and within that framework, the specific thing I had chosen to do with my life fell outside the boundaries of what he considered productive in any meaningful sense. He told me this, not once. Across my entire adult life, in various forms and with various degrees of directness, from the specific conversation we had when I was 18 and told him I was going to the Rhode Island School of Design to study interior architecture, through the conversation we had at my graduation when he told every family member who came to congratulate me that the degree I had just received was, in his exact words, money spent on something that is not a profession, to the various subsequent years in which he asked with specific regularity whether I was planning to find a real job, and whether the work I was doing could actually support a household, and whether I had considered what would happen to me financially if the design work did not continue. He meant these things as expressions of concern. I understood them as expressions of concern. I also understood them as the specific sustained communication of someone who did not believe that what I had chosen was real work, and that the not believing, regardless of its origin in genuine care, had a specific and ongoing cost. I stood at the podium in the atrium of the Whitmore Cardiac Center, and I found my father's face in the fourth row, and I thought about 22 years of that specific sustained communication, and I understood that the building behind me was the most complete answer I had ever given to it. I did not say that in my remarks. My remarks were professional and appropriate and organized around the design philosophy of the space and what we had tried to achieve and the specific thanks I owed to St. Catherine's and to the Whitmore family and to the design team who had worked with me across 14 months. But I thought it. Before I take you to the podium, let me take you to the beginning. Because the beginning is where the specific shape of everything that followed was established, and because the beginning is not where I think you will expect it to be. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, the middle child of Werner and Ingrid Voss, who had come to the United States from Germany in 1975, when my father was offered a position at the manufacturing company in Providence, where he would spend the next 38 years. My mother had been a secondary school biology teacher in Munich and had taught, after appropriate credentialing, at a middle school in Providence for 26 years. The Voss household was organized around the specific values of two people who had built their American lives through the particular disciplines of science and engineering and biology, the disciplines of people for whom the physical world was primary evidence, and for whom the ability to understand and manipulate that physical world through the specific mechanisms of professional training was the most legible form of human competence. My older brother Thomas became a civil engineer. My younger brother Patrick became a physician. I became a designer. I do not present this as a story of rebellion. I was not rebelling against anything when I told my parents at 16 that I wanted to go to RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, which was 15 minutes from our house, and which I had been visiting since I was 8 years old on the specific family outings that Providence families take to cultural institutions. I was going toward something. The going toward was specific and informed and organized around the particular clarity that some people have from an early age about what they are supposed to do with their lives. What I felt in the RISD galleries and studios from the time I was 8 was the specific feeling of recognition that I later learned to identify as the feeling of being in the right place. Not excitement, exactly. Recognition. The feeling of walking into a room where the activity occurring in the room is the activity your mind naturally does when left to its own direction. I drew from the time I could hold a pencil. Not representationally, though I could draw representationally when I needed to. I drew spaces, rooms and buildings, and the specific relationship between interior and exterior that characterizes the way spaces feel to the people inside them. I drew light sources and the shadows they produced. I drew the specific quality of different materials under different lighting conditions. I was 11 years old, and I was drawing architectural cross-sections in the margins of my school notebooks, with the specific focused absorption of someone who is practicing something they intend to become very good at. My mother encouraged this, not because she understood exactly what it was pointing toward, but because she had the specific quality of a biology teacher who understood that competence in any domain developed through the particular combination of natural aptitude and sustained practice, and she was watching her daughter practice something with the intensity and the focus that serious learning required, and she believed in the practice. My father watched with more ambivalence. He was not opposed to the drawing. He was not opposed to RISD as an institution. He was specifically concerned about what the drawing and RISD were pointing toward professionally, and his concern expressed itself in the particular form it always expressed itself, which was the practical question, and then what? And then, what is a useful question? I want to say this clearly because I think it deserves acknowledgement. When your child is proposing to spend 4 years and significant money on a degree in a field where the professional path is less clearly defined than engineering or medicine, the question of, and then, what is not unreasonable? My father's concern was not without basis in reality. He was asking the practical question that practical people ask when the path forward is not obvious, and he was asking it because he was afraid I was going to struggle, and he wanted to prevent the struggling. The problem was not the question. The problem was that the question never stopped, regardless of what the answers produced across 22 years of building a practice and a reputation, and eventually a body of work that was, by any honest external assessment, the legitimate professional accomplishment of someone who had made exactly the choice she was right to make. The question persisted because my father's framework for understanding productive work did not include the category that my work occupied, and no amount of external validation that I accumulated within that category could make it legible to him within his framework, because the framework did not have a space for it. This is the specific thing I spent 22 years understanding, and I want to tell you about those 22 years before I tell you about the building, because the 22 years are the specific context within which the building matters. I enrolled at RISD in September of the year I turned 18, in the Interior Architecture program, which is the specific discipline that sits between architecture and interior design, and that understands buildings primarily from the inside out, as environments that human beings inhabit, and that can be designed to serve or undermine the specific things that human beings are doing inside them. The 4 years at RISD were the most formative of my professional life, not primarily because of what was taught, but because of the specific community of people who were learning there simultaneously, people who understood the particular form of intelligence that design required, and who were practicing it seriously, and being surrounded by serious practice after years of feeling that my own serious practice was somehow aberrant or excessive was the specific experience of someone arriving, finally, in the right place. I graduated in the spring of the year I turned 22. My father attended the graduation. He had been proud of my completion of the degree in the specific way that parents who have funded something expensive are proud when the funded thing concludes successfully, regardless of whether they believe in what was learned. He took photographs. He shook hands with my professors. He ate the graduation lunch my mother had planned at a restaurant in Providence. He also, across the graduation lunch and the subsequent family gathering at our house, told every person who congratulated me some version of the same thing, which was that the degree was very nice, but of course Margaret still needed to find a way to make a living from it, and that he hoped she would be able to do that, because it was a very expensive education for something that was not exactly a profession. He said these things with the specific warmth of genuine concern, rather than with any malice. I believe this. The warmth was real. The message it carried was also real. I moved to Boston after graduation. I had a position at a small interior design firm in the South End that paid the specific amount that entry-level positions at small design firms pay, which was enough to rent an apartment with 2 roommates, and to eat, and to pay the specific debt I had accumulated across 4 years at a private art school. I was 22, and I was doing the work, and the work was real, and I was good at it, which I knew from the quality of the feedback I was receiving from the senior designers at the firm, and from the specific quality of my own attention to what I was doing, which was the attention of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be. My father called once a week. He was interested in my life and in how I was managing financially, and in whether the work was going well. In these calls, he sometimes asked the and then what question in various forms. Whether I had thought about the long-term trajectory of the field, whether I had looked into whether there were additional credentials that might make the professional path more stable, whether the firm I was working for was the kind that offered any kind of security. I answered the questions as honestly as I could across those early years, which meant I said I was building towards something, and that the building required time, and that the something was a body of work and a professional reputation, and the specific expertise that sustained practice in a demanding field produces, and that none of that was available on a faster timeline than the one I was on. He received these answers with the specific quality of someone who understood them as reasonable sounding, but who remained unconvinced that the reasonable sounding trajectory would produce what I believed it would produce. I spent 5 years at the South End firm. I left to take a position at a larger practice in Boston that specialized in healthcare design, the specific subspecialty of interior architecture that designs hospitals and medical facilities, and the particular environments that people occupy when they are the most vulnerable they are likely to be in their adult lives. The subspecialty appealed to me from the specific angle that had always drawn me to design, which was the question of what a space does to the people inside it. And in healthcare environments, the question was the most direct and the most consequential that any designer could encounter. Healthcare design is not decorative. It is functional in the specific demanding way of medical facilities, where every decision about layout and material and lighting and wayfinding has direct implications for the people using the space. Whether patients navigating a complex facility while frightened and unwell, or clinicians moving through environments where efficiency and clarity are not optional but essential, or families in waiting rooms who need the specific combination of privacy and connection that a well-designed waiting space can provide, and a poorly designed one cannot. I spent 7 years at the healthcare design practice in Boston. I was promoted twice. I led projects. I developed the specific expertise in evidence-based healthcare design that the subspecialty requires, the ability to translate research on how physical environments affect patient outcomes, staff retention, and infection control into specific design decisions that serve those research findings. My father continued his weekly calls. He noticed across those 7 years that I seemed to be doing well, and he expressed this with the specific warmth of genuine parental pride, though the pride was organized around my apparent stability and success rather than around any particular understanding of what I was doing. He did not know what evidence-based healthcare design was. He understood that I was working for a firm and being promoted, which mapped onto a professional trajectory he could recognize. What changed in the 12th year after graduation was not anything dramatic. It was the specific accumulation of 12 years of work arriving at a point where the work I wanted to do required the specific autonomy that working for someone else did not provide. I started my own practice. The practice, Voss Interior Architecture, opened in the January of the year I turned 34. It was me and one employee, a project coordinator named Alicia, who had been with me at the healthcare design firm, and who understood my work well enough to be the specific kind of operational support that a founding principal needs in the first years of an independent practice. I had 3 client relationships that I had developed over 12 years of building the kind of reputation that produces client relationships, people who had worked with me at the firm or who had been referred by people who had worked with me, and who trusted my work specifically enough to follow me when I went out on my own. The first year was the specific financial experience of the first year of any independent professional practice, which is the experience of someone who has traded financial security for professional autonomy, and who is in the particular period of learning whether the trade was worth what it cost. It was difficult in the specific practical sense. The income was lower than it had been at the firm. The uncertainty was higher. The responsibility for every aspect of the practice, not only the design work, but the business development and the project management and the billing and the client relationships, was mine rather than distributed across an organizational structure. I did not tell my father the specific details of the first year's difficulty, not because I was hiding anything, but because the difficulty was the specific difficulty of a first year that was going the way first years go when they are ultimately going to be fine, and distinguishing that from the difficulty of a first year that is not going to be fine required a judgment that I was capable of making, but that my father, without the context, was not capable of making. And I did not want and then what question applied to a period of difficulty that was part of a larger trajectory he did not have the framework to see. My mother knew more. We had always been closer in the specific way of a mother and a daughter who share a particular quality of attention to the world, and she understood the practice's trajectory with more accuracy and more patience than my father's framework allowed. She said, in the second year, when the practice had stabilized and I was able to tell her the specific details with more confidence, "Your father worries because he loves you, and he doesn't have another way to show it." I said, "I know." She said, "He also doesn't understand what you do." I said, "I know that too." She said, "He would if he saw it." I said, "I've tried to show him." She said, "You've tried to explain it. That's different." I thought about the distinction she was making for a long time after that conversation. Explaining was what I had been doing across 22 years of and then what question? Describing the work in terms that I understood and that I believed were legible, and that my father received as reasonable sounding without becoming comprehensible within his framework. My mother was suggesting that the explanation was the wrong mechanism, that what was needed was the seeing. I had not had a project that offered the right scale and the right context for the seeing. I was working on the right projects, but they were not in Providence, where my father lived, and they were not the kind of projects that produced the specific public occasion of a dedication ceremony that would bring my father into the space I had designed and let the space speak for itself. That changed in the spring of the year I turned 44, when St. Catherine's Hospital in Providence issued a request for proposals for the interior design of the new Whitmore Cardiac Center, a $40 million addition funded by the Whitmore family, whose patriarch had received the cardiac care that saved his life at St. Catherine's and who wanted to give back to the institution in a way that improved that care for the next generation of patients. I submitted a proposal. I want to tell you about the proposal process before I tell you about the commission, because understanding what the proposal contained is necessary to understanding what the building eventually became, and why the building was the specific answer to 22 years of the and then what question that nothing I had said across those 22 years had managed to be. The request for proposals went to 11 firms. I was not the obvious choice. There were larger firms with more established reputations in healthcare design. There were firms with existing relationships with St. Catherine's. There were firms whose portfolios included more high-profile completed projects than mine. What I had was something different from scale or relationship or portfolio breadth. I had 14 years of specific focused expertise in exactly the kind of design problem that the Whitmore Cardiac Center represented, which was the design of cardiac care environments. And I had, across those 14 years, developed a specific research-informed philosophy about what those environments should do for the people inside them. The research on cardiac recovery environments is specific and substantial. There is a significant body of peer-reviewed literature on the relationship between the physical design of hospital environments and patient outcomes in cardiovascular care specifically, covering variables including the effects of natural light exposure on recovery times, the acoustic environment, and its relationship to stress hormones that affect cardiac function, the specific layout decisions that affect family presence and the documented correlation between family presence and patient recovery, the wayfinding systems that reduce the anxiety of navigation in a medical environment when anxiety itself is a cardiovascular risk factor. I had been reading this literature for 14 years. I had been translating it into design decisions for 14 years. My proposal for the Whitmore Cardiac Center was not a presentation of aesthetic preferences or stylistic choices. It was a specific argument, grounded in the research, about what the space should do for the people who would occupy it and how every design decision I was proposing served that purpose. I proposed a design organized around 4 principles, each one derived from the research: maximum utilization of natural light throughout patient areas, acoustic design that achieved specific decibel targets in patient rooms and recovery spaces that research had identified as optimal for cardiac recovery, a family integration model that provided dedicated family spaces adjacent to patient rooms rather than in a separate waiting area, because the research on the benefits of family presence during cardiac recovery was specific and substantial, and a wayfinding system designed from the perspective of the most vulnerable and least cognitively available user, the patient who has just had a cardiac event and is moving through an unfamiliar environment while frightened and physically compromised. The proposal was specific and detailed and grounded, and it was mine in the particular sense that it represented 14 years of thinking about exactly this problem. St. Catherine's selected Voss interior architecture. I want to tell you about the phone call I made to my father the day I received the commission, because it was one of the most specific moments in 22 years of navigating our relationship about my work, and because it is directly relevant to what happened at the dedication ceremony. I called him on a Thursday evening in the spring, the specific evening I had received the letter from St. Catherine's. My mother answered. I told her. She said, "Oh, Margaret." Her voice had the specific quality of someone receiving news that is larger than one thing, that carries the weight of what it means professionally and also what it means in the context of everything the work had been navigating for 22 years. She understood immediately. She said, "St. Catherine's. That's here." I said, "Yes. In Providence." She said, "Your father is going to see it." I said, "That's part of why I'm telling you first." She said, "Do you want to tell him yourself?" I said, "Yes." "Can you put him on?" My father came to the phone. I told him about the commission. I described the project, a new cardiac wing at St. Catherine's Hospital, $40 million, 14 months of design work, the specific scale and significance of the project in terms he could recognize as meaningful even within his framework. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "St. Catherine's. That's the hospital where Thomas had his appendix out." I said, "Yes." He said, "How did you get this project?" I said, "I submitted a proposal and they selected me." He said, "Over other firms?" I said, "Yes, over 10 other firms." He was quiet again. He said, "That's very good, Margaret." Not, "That's wonderful." Not, "I'm so proud of you." Very good. The specific contained response of a man whose framework for acknowledging professional achievement includes a maximum expression of approval that is 2 words, "Very good." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "Will you be coming to Providence for the project?" I said, "Frequently. The client meetings are here. I'll need to be on site regularly through the construction phase." He said, "Maybe we can have dinner." I said, "Yes, I'd like that." He said, "Your mother will be pleased." I said, "I know." I hung up and sat in my home office in Boston for a long time after that call. Very good. 14 months of work to come, 22 years behind me. Very good. I started work the following Monday. I want to describe the 14 months of the design and construction process at a level of detail that serves this story because the process itself is relevant to what the building eventually was and why it was that. The programming phase, the first 3 months, involved the specific research-intensive work of understanding St. Catherine's existing cardiac care operations, interviewing the clinical staff who would work in the new space, reviewing the research literature on cardiac care environments with the project's medical director, and translating all of that input into a specific spatial program, the document that describes what spaces the building needs to contain and what each space needs to do. The clinical staff interviews were the most important part of the programming phase. Not because the clinicians had design expertise, but because they had the specific knowledge of what happened in cardiac care environments that no amount of research literature could provide, the particular granular understanding of daily operations that comes from being in the space performing the work. I interviewed 46 people across 6 weeks, from attending cardiologists to nursing assistants, from the social workers who supported patients and families to the environmental services staff who maintained the space. I filled 4 notebooks with specific observations and direct quotes, and the particular insights that emerge when you ask clinical staff what they wish their environment did differently, and you listen to the answers with the full attention they deserve. The programming document that emerged from those interviews was 112 pages. It was the most specific document I had ever produced in a professional context, organized around what the space needed to do for each category of person who would use it, derived directly from the research literature and from the clinical staff interviews, and from my 14 years of thinking about exactly these questions. The schematic design phase, the following 3 months, was the translation of the programming document into spatial concepts, the specific act of taking what the space needed to do and finding the built form that would allow it to do those things. This is the phase that non-designers most commonly associate with design, the phase of drawings and renderings, though it is the phase that makes the least sense in isolation from the programming phase that precedes it, because the drawings only mean something in relation to the specific requirements they are meant to fulfill. I designed the Whitmore Cardiac Center around a central organizing principle that I had been building toward for 14 years, but had never had a project at sufficient scale to fully execute. The principle was that the primary navigation of the space should be achievable through the specific senses available to the most cognitively compromised user, which in a cardiac facility meant someone in significant physiological distress, and that every spatial decision should therefore prioritize legibility, which is the quality of a space that communicates its organization clearly to the people inside it, without requiring them to consciously decode it. Legibility is achieved through specific design decisions, consistent spatial hierarchy, which means the most important spaces are immediately distinguishable from the less important ones through scale and light and materiality. Clear primary circulation paths, which means the routes people need to travel are different in character from the routes that are peripheral. And what I describe to clients as spatial grammar, the particular quality of a space where the logic of its organization is perceptible to someone moving through it, even if they cannot articulate the logic explicitly. The Whitmore Cardiac Center was designed around a single primary circulation spine, a curved corridor that ran the length of the building and from which all patient rooms, family spaces, and clinical areas branched in a consistent pattern. The spine was distinguished from all other spaces by its ceiling height, its natural light, a continuous clear-story window running its entire length, and its floor material, a warm-toned terrazzo that contrasted with the carpet used in patient rooms and the resilient flooring used in clinical areas. Someone navigating the building for the first time, even under the specific cognitive and physical stress of a cardiac event, could orient themselves to the spine by looking for the ceiling height and the light and the floor material, and from the spine they could find any destination in the building through the consistent spatial grammar of the branching pattern. This is not simple to execute at the scale of a $40 million hospital addition. The construction documents, the specific technical drawings that translate the design into instructions for the contractors who build it, ran to approximately 4,000 pages across all the design disciplines. Coordinating those 4,000 pages, ensuring that every system in the building, the structural, the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing, the fire protection, was integrated with the spatial design I had developed, required the particular sustained attention that large-scale healthcare design demands. I was in Providence every week through the construction phase, every week for 9 months. I had dinners with my father during many of those visits, the specific ordinary dinners of a father and daughter eating at the same table, talking about things that were easier than the things that needed to be said. Thomas's career, Patrick's family, my mother's retirement plans, the particular domestic topics that families cover at dinner tables when the larger topics require more space than dinner allows. My father occasionally asked about the project. His questions had the character of questions from someone trying to understand something that remained outside his framework. How many people would work in the new wing? How long patients typically stayed in cardiac care? Whether the hospital was satisfied with how things were going? Practical questions with practical answers. The specific form of engagement available to someone who cannot ask about the design itself, because the design is in a language he does not read. I answered the practical questions. I did not try to explain the design. My mother visited the construction site with me once, in the 8th month of construction, when the spine was fully enclosed and the clear story was in place, and the building had reached the stage where someone with imagination could see what it was going to be. I walked her through the space, and I described what each area was, and what it was meant to do, and she listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that mattered to her. At the end of the walkthrough, she stood in the center of the spine and looked toward the clear story, and she said, "It's very calming." I said, "That's what it's supposed to be." She said, "For the patients?" I said, "For everyone. The staff and the families, too. The research shows that the environment affects everyone who occupies it, not only the patients." She said, "Your father should see this." I said, "He'll see it at the dedication." She said, "Before that. He should see it before there are 200 people in it." I arranged a visit. My father and mother came to the site the week before the dedication, when the building was complete and furnished and ready for occupancy, but not yet open. I walked them through alone, the three of us, in the specific quiet of an empty building. My father walked slowly. He touched things, not in a casual or distracted way, with the specific attentiveness of an engineer encountering a built environment, running his hand along the terrazzo floor of the spine and looking up at the clear story and stopping to examine the junction between the ceiling material and the window frame. He said, at one point, while we were standing in a patient room that looked out through a large window toward a courtyard planted with a small grove of birch trees, How do the birch trees work in winter, when they've lost their leaves? It was an engineer's question. The specific practical question of someone who understands that a design feature needs to work across all conditions, not only the optimal ones. I said, the structure of the birch trunks is the primary visual element. In winter, the white bark is actually more visible against the sky than it is against the foliage. The winter version is what I designed for, because cardiac events peak in winter months, and the patients in this room in January need something to look at as much as the patients in August do. He looked at the window for a long time. He said, "You thought about that specifically. January patients." I said, "Everything in this building was thought about specifically. Every material, every light source, every view. The research on what helps cardiac patients recover is specific, and I tried to build every finding into the space." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How much of this is you and how much is the research?" I said, "The research tells you what the space needs to do. I make the decisions about how the space does it. The birch trees are my choice. The clear story is my choice. The curved spine instead of a straight corridor is my choice. The research tells me that views to nature and natural light and spatial legibility are all important. How you achieve those things within the specific constraints of this building on this site with this budget is the design." He said, "So it's like engineering?" I said, "Yes. In the way that matters most, yes." He looked at the window again. He said, "The birch trees were a good choice." He turned and continued the walkthrough. The dedication ceremony was on a Thursday evening in September. 260 people in the atrium of the Whitmore Cardiac Center, the space I had designed for patient arrival and family orientation, and the particular social activity of a hospital wing that includes not only medical care, but the specific human occasions of waiting and receiving news, and the particular intimacy of families gathered around a person who is ill. The atrium was designed around the same principles as the rest of the building. Natural light through a large west-facing window that caught the late afternoon sun at exactly the hour most ceremonies occurred. A ceiling that acknowledged the scale of the space without making it feel institutional. A floor material that was warm underfoot and warm in color. The particular combination of materials and light that produces what I have come to think of as the feeling of being held by a building, rather than being processed by one. I found my father in the fourth row when I looked out from the podium. He was seated beside my mother. He was wearing the specific dark suit he wore for occasions that he understood required formality, the suit I had seen at Thomas's wedding and Patrick's residency graduation, and which was, in its specific being worn for this occasion, a form of communication from my father that this occasion was one he was taking seriously. I gave my remarks. I described the design philosophy and the specific intentions behind the choices I had made, and the research that had informed them and the clinical staff whose insights had shaped what I had built. I thanked the Whitmore family and St. Catherine's and the design team. I said that the building was, more than anything I had built before it, the specific expression of what I believed design was for, which was to serve the people inside it in the most consequential moments of their lives. When I stepped back from the podium, the president of St. Catherine's gave brief remarks, then the CEO of the hospital system, then the oldest member of the Whitmore family, a woman in her 80s who had been part of the family's charitable giving for decades, and who spoke about why the family had chosen to fund a cardiac facility and what they hoped the building would accomplish. Then there was a ribbon cutting, and the specific movement of 260 people from the atrium into the building for the first time, the particular moment of a building opening when the people it was designed to serve encounter it for the first time. I stood in the atrium after most people had moved into the building, and I watched the remaining few making their way through the space, and I was thinking about 14 months and 22 years simultaneously when my father appeared beside me. He said, "Come here." He walked me to the center of the atrium, the specific place I had designed to be the orientation point of the entire building, the place where the spine began and where the clear story was most visible, and where the view through the west-facing window caught the September light at the specific angle that made the room feel like something you wanted to stay in. He stood there for a long time, not speaking, looking up at the clear story and out through the window and at the floor and the walls. He said, "How did you know where to put the window?" I said, "I spent 3 days on site at different times of day in September and December and March, watching where the light came from and what it did to the space." The window is positioned to catch direct sunlight for approximately 4 hours in the afternoon, which is when the research shows that light exposure has the greatest effect on the patients most likely to be in this atrium during daytime hours. He said, "You spent 3 days watching the light." I said, "Yes." He said, "I spent 3 days once figuring out the stress load on a specific type of bracket for a conveyor system. Different thing, same principle." I looked at my father. He said, "You see a problem and you study it until you understand what it needs, and then you make the thing that does what it needs to do." I said, "Yes. That's what I do." He said, "I didn't understand that before." I said, "I know." He said, "I thought design was about making things look a certain way." I said, "That's part of it. It's not the main part." He said, "The main part is making things work." I said, "The main part is making things serve the people inside them." He was quiet. He said, "That's harder than making things look a certain way?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a very long time, standing in the center of the atrium of the building his daughter had designed, in the specific September light that came through the west-facing window she had positioned after 3 days of watching the light. He said, "The birch trees in the courtyard, you can see them from here." I said, "Yes, that was intentional. I wanted the orientation point of the building to connect visually to the courtyard that the patient rooms face, so that someone standing here could look in the direction of the patients." He said, "So the families standing here can look toward their people." I said, "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "Margaret." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm proud of you, specifically." I want to say that specifically because I don't think I've said it specifically before. I looked at my father. He said, "I was worried for a long time that you were doing something that wasn't going to work out. I was wrong. I was wrong, and I said things that weren't useful because I was worried, and I want to tell you that I was wrong." He said, "This building works." I'm an engineer, and I can see that this building works. Not only the structure, though the structure seems excellent. The space. The way it does what you said it was supposed to do. He said, "I looked at the birch courtyard through the patient room window, and I thought about a person in that room who has just had a heart attack. And I thought about what it would mean to look out that window and see those trees. And I understood something about what you do that I hadn't understood before." I said, "What did you understand?" He said, "That you were solving a problem, a harder problem than I gave you credit for." I stood in the atrium of the Whitmore Cardiac Center beside my father, and I received what he was saying in the specific, complete way that things deserve to be received when they have been 22 years in arriving. I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "The birch trees." I said, "Yes." He said, "In winter the bark is more visible." I said, "Yes." He nodded. The nod of an engineer acknowledging a specific good solution to a specific real problem. We stood there for a while longer. My mother found us eventually. She saw our faces and she understood what had happened without either of us saying anything about it, in the specific way of a woman who has known both of us for our entire lives, and who had been the particular bridge between us across 22 years, and who recognized the specific quality of the air between two people who have finally said something that needed to be said. She put her hand on my father's arm. He put his hand over hers. The three of us stood in the atrium of the building for a while, in the September light through the west-facing window, while 260 people moved through the space, and the birch trees were visible in the courtyard, and the spine of the building extended away from us into the distance with the curved ceiling and the clear-story light and the warm terrazzo floor. I want to tell you what the years since the dedication have been, because the story does not end at the podium, and the ending deserves honesty. My father came to my studio in Boston 4 months after the dedication. He had not been to my studio before, in the 12 years I had been running my own practice. I had not invited him. Not because I didn't want him there, but because I had not been certain before the dedication that being there would give him what I needed him to see. He spent 3 hours in the studio. He looked at the project drawings on the walls, the specific large-format prints of the work I was proudest of. He asked questions about each one. What is this building? What was the problem you were solving here? What does this floor plan tell you about how the space works? He asked questions for 3 hours, and I answered every one. And the answers were in the language of design, but translated. Because I had spent 22 years developing the ability to translate the design language into terms that people who did not speak it could receive, and my father, who spoke the language of engineering, could receive more than most. At the end of 3 hours, he said, "You have a lot of work." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good work." I said, "I think so." He said, "I can see why they hire you." I said, "Because the buildings work." He said, "Because the buildings work." He looked at the print of the Whitmore Cardiac Center on the wall, the section drawing that showed the spine and the clear story, and the branching pattern of the spaces and the birch courtyard at the end. He said, "Can I have a copy of this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "For my office at home." I said, "Of course." He has it in his office at home now. I have seen it there on visits. It is not framed elaborately. It is the specific functional print of a working drawing, a cross-section of a building that his daughter designed, pinned to the wall of the office where he spent 38 years doing the specific kind of work he knew how to understand. Beside a drawing now of the work he had spent 22 years failing to understand, and that he understands now in the particular specific way of an engineer who has stood inside a building and recognized that it works. I call him twice a week. He calls me once. The calls are different from what they were before the dedication, not dramatically different, not the specific transformation of a relationship that had not worked into one that worked perfectly. They are different in the specific way of something that has moved, incrementally and then suddenly, from one position to another position that is closer to what both people needed. He asks about my projects, specific questions. How is the children's hospital going? The one in New Haven? Did the new clinic in Hartford resolve the structural issue with the roof? He does not ask, and then what anymore? I want to tell you about my grandmother before I finish, because she is in this story even though she died when I was 25 and was not there for any of the years it describes. Her name was Frieda Hormann, my mother's mother, who had been a tailor for 40 years in Munich before she came to Providence when I was 14, to live with a friend from her working years who had also immigrated. She lived 4 blocks from our house on Thayer Street for 11 years before she died, and I visited her once a week across those years, in the specific way of a granddaughter who has found in her grandmother's company the particular quality of attention that she does not find everywhere. Frieda made things, clothes primarily, but also the other objects that hands like hers make when they are resting from the primary work. Quilts and small embroideries and the specific functional objects that German craft traditions produce. She made things with the focused, complete attention of someone for whom making was the primary form of thinking, the mode through which she processed the world. She said to me once, when I was 16 and describing to her what I wanted to study and why, "The people who make things that last are the people who understand what the thing is for, not what it looks like, what it does. A jacket that looks beautiful but cannot keep you warm is not a jacket. It is a picture of a jacket. I have thought about that many times across 22 years of practice. The Whitmore Cardiac Center keeps people warm, not literally. In the specific sense my grandmother meant, it does what a building of its kind is for. It holds the people inside it at the moments when being held by a building is the specific thing that the people inside it need. That is what I make. That is what I have always made. My father understands this now. He understood it standing in the atrium in the September light, looking through the west-facing window at the specific angle that I had spent 3 days on site to identify, seeing the birch trees in the courtyard from the orientation point of a building that was designed, from the first drawing to the last, to serve the most vulnerable people who would ever walk through its doors. "Very good," he said at graduation. "I'm proud of you," he said in the atrium. The distance between those two sentences is 22 years and one building, and the building is the specific answer to the question he asked across every year of those 22, which was, and then what? And then this. This is the then. Here is what 22 years of the, and then what question and one cardiac wing in Providence taught me. I know that the frameworks people carry for understanding what constitutes real and meaningful work are more durable than the evidence that challenges them, and that the evidence most likely to reach through a framework is not the evidence that argues against it, but the evidence that presents itself in the specific language the framework can receive. My father did not change his mind about the value of my work because I explained it to him more clearly. He changed it because he stood inside a building I had designed and recognized, in the language of someone who had spent 38 years making things work, that the building worked. I know that making things that serve the people inside them in their most vulnerable moments is not a lesser ambition than making things that move or calculate or manufacture. It is the specific ambition of someone who has understood that the built environment is not background to human experience, but active participant in it, and that designing it well is among the most consequential things a person can do with their professional life. I know that the answer to and then what is almost never available in the language of the question. The question is asked by someone who cannot yet see what is being built. The answer is the building itself, visible only when it is complete, and only to someone who is standing inside it in the specific light that falls through the window you positioned after 3 days of watching where the light came from. And I know that my grandmother, who made things that lasted, and who understood that the things which last are the things that do what they are for, would have stood in the atrium of the Whitmore Cardiac Center, and looked up at the clear story, and felt the September light, and looked through the west-facing window at the birch courtyard and said, "Yes, that is a building. Not a picture of a building." I think about that sometimes when I am standing in a space I have designed, feeling whether it does what it is for. It is the test I always apply. The Whitmore Cardiac Center passes. That is my story. A graduation lunch where very good was the maximum available expression of parental pride. 22 years of, and then what? 3 days watching where the light came from in September. And an atrium in September light where my father stood beside me and recognized, in the language of an engineer, that the building his daughter had designed worked. If this reminded you of work you have done that was called into question across years by someone who loved you and did not understand it, and of the specific moment when the work finally spoke for itself in a language that person could receive, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who is in the middle of the years between the doing and the being understood. Who needs to know that the answer is in the work and the work takes the time it takes? Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.